All right, guys. I had planned on giving these notes to you live in class on Monday and Tuesday, and I am sorry I am not feeling so well. So I'm going to do a recording here of what I would have delivered live in class, and then you already have a recording of what I was going to assign for after class. Okay, so we're going to be covering in this first video, Woodrow Wilson, Wilson's version, if you will, of progressivism, and America's entry into World War One. The second video really kind of covers America during World War One, especially at war. We're going to try to cover the American home front during World War One during this first video. Okay, so we're going to open up with, as it pertains, I guess, kind of to this notion of progressivism and Wilson progressivism. We've been covering Women's History Month very often through the lens of the time period that we're studying, time period 1898 to 1945. And this is the last day of Women's History Month. And I thought it would be interesting to take a look at the history of Women's History Month because most of what we want to cover with respect to at least the front end of this movement, okay, we've already covered. So if you will click on this link, this hyperlink to this image where we already talk about, Carrie Chapman Catt and Alice Paul and some of the figures that we've already spoken about. We've got a video talking about the history of women's history. So check that out and come on back to me. Okay. So we're moving along in our unit map, guys. The bulletin for today will be updated from what you see here with respect to the fact that we're now doing this by video. But we're not going to lose a day by my absence. Okay. I apologize for being gone, but we're going to keep moving along here. All right. We're going to open up with a little bit of a repeat. Remember, the election of 1912 was an interesting one that we covered in our last class. This is where I think Teddy Roosevelt, yes, my man, probably lets his ego kind of hurt his progressive Republican causes a little bit from an electoral standpoint. Remember, he had kind of been looking over the shoulder, proverbially, figuratively, literally, of his handpicked successor, William Howard Taft. Roosevelt and Taft, of course, both Republicans, but here Roosevelt opens up a third party, the Bull Moose Party. And it's a very progressive party. He doesn't necessarily like the direction that Taft had taken the Republican Party in. There are a lot of Republicans who very much still love Teddy. And so the Republican Party vote essentially gets split. Split a little bit further more by some other progressives that perhaps voted for that man we had mentioned before, Eugene V. Debs, the socialist candidate, who was a little more progressive than progressive. And so ultimately, with kind of a tri-factoring of fracturing, I should say, of the otherwise Republican vote, what we see is a Democrat return to office, and that would be Woodrow Wilson. He also runs on a progressive reform platform here. There's all the candidates are progressive to some degree. Wilson, perhaps less so than the others, probably more closely aligned with Taft than the others. Regardless, we have a change of partisan power at the White House here in the election of 1912 with the election of Woodrow Wilson. Now, Wilson's progressivism is largely going to focus on what he calls the triple wall of privilege. He wants to reduce tariffs. He wants to kind of attack trusts, okay? Teddy Roosevelt had kind of been a little bit of a trust buster, but to a certain degree. Wilson is very kind of similar in that regard. He creates the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission, federal governmental agency. Remember, that's kind of progressive in of itself, right? That's going to investigate monopolies, but exempt labor unions. Okay. He increases the power of the Sherman Antitrust Act with the Clayton Antitrust Act in 1914. So he's got a couple notions here of kind of breaking down some of these trusts, as we call them, monopolies, etc. And finally, he wants to get into banking reform, and he creates the Federal Reserve Act. So the Federal Reserve, that is still with us today, is really responsible for regulating money supply, and this is intended to prevent these previous panics, right, that we had seen in the American economy. That were a result of limited money supply. So the Fed, as it were, still does this today by altering what we call the overnight interest rate, what banks can charge each other for interest rates and what the Fed charges. And essentially, what we have is that the federal government has a hand now in regulating how much money is out there in the economy. Okay. And of course, with respect to progressive era reforms under Wilson, um, especially as it relates to the economy, okay, um, we see the 16th Amendment, and that's the progressive income tax being established that the federal government can and will institute a progressive income tax to pay for a lot of these government programs. And we talked about that before. But the progressive era reforms under Wilson are largely economically focused on especially the triple wall of privilege: tariffs, trusts, and banking reform. Um, Progressivism under Wilson is successful in a lot of working class aspects, but is certainly not in social reform aspects. Okay. Um, the rights of women and minorities are somewhat addressed. Certainly, there are significant, I think, advancements for the rights of women and some minorities. But African Americans, remember, are still living in uh, a significantly disadvantaged Jim Crow segregated America. And while progressive reforms are all good and well for a lot of kind of workplace, working class reforms, advancements with respect to some labor unions, or at least some of the ideas of labor unions we talk about, right? Reducing work hours, increasing wages, overtime wages, limiting child labor, instituting, reforms as it relates to public education, to public housing, etc. Um, Race is largely ignored from these progressive approaches. Most progressives are simply not interested in advancing the cause of social justice for African Americans. This is, as I said, very much a Jim Crow America. We are still living, remember, in that age dictated by the 1896 Plessy v. Ferguson ruling that had stated in one of the most poorly adjudicated decisions in Supreme Court history that separate but equal is acceptable constitutional law of the land. Uh, African Americans have virtually no equality under this system. There are increased instances of violence and lynchings against Black Americans. And African Americans are by and large ignored by progressive politicians. So we can kind of give a lot of credit to progressives for advancements made for the benefit of the working class people during this time period. But we have to recognize in the same breath that their advances ignored, uh, flat out ignored, showed no interest in African Americans. Now, there are a couple of African American civil rights leaders that are very significant, and we want to understand who they are and what they stood for during this time. And quite frankly, as you see here, are some of the debates between them. Um, You've probably heard of both of these names, Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois. Booker T. Washington, you've probably heard in the context of educational reform. And Booker T. Washington advocates for Americans, African Americans, to acquire vocational skills so that they gain some economic self security, some self respect, um, and he establishes the Tuskegee Institute as one such educational institution to advance these causes. He thinks that these economic advances are going to promote civil rights. Um, he doesn't necessarily challenge upfront, in your face, kind of the notion of white supremacy. He is arguing for some kind of incremental steps towards civil rights through economic advancement. Critics of his, like W.E.B. Du Bois, might call him an accommodationist, or they would argue against Washington's gradualism. Okay. And as I said, that would include W.E.B. Du Bois, who writes The Souls of Black Folk in 1903 and pushes forward with the Niagara movement in 1905. He helps to found the NAACP in 1909. And he is a little bit more radical for the time in that he demands immediate political and social equality for all Black people across the country. Um, Speaking of some women's history, Ida B. Wells joins the chorus with W.E.B. Du Bois in her anti-lynching campaign, the women's suffrage movement, and civil rights on a immediate basis for all Black people. The point is that we do see, even if some varied approaches, we see Black activists have to take up their own cause because, again, they're largely being left behind by the white powers that be. And that includes Woodrow Wilson. And in fact, one aspect of Wilson that is probably worthy of criticism is that he displayed some instances where he could rightfully be accused of being racist, including when he screens at the White House and allegedly, at least, offers significant praise for the film um, Birth of a Nation. And that is a film by D.W. Griffith that is really a defense of the rise of the Ku Klux Klan, in that it portrays the Klan as heroic saviors of white culture in the face of incompetent at best and evil at worst Black Americans intent upon going so far as to rape white women, and it promotes all sorts of stereotypes that would justify the rise of the Klan, which stands, of course, for white supremacy. Um, and uh, and Woodrow Wilson screens this film, meaning he watches this film at the White House and allegedly offers significant praise for the film. The film is still notable today because D.W. Griffith employs incredibly advanced, sophisticated um, filmmaking techniques in the production of this film. And I've got a little link here that is worthy of your time to click here and watch a little bit about the Birth of Nation and about Woodrow Wilson's relationship with Griffith and the film and the impact of the film in general. So check that out and come back to me. Thanks. Okay. So when we talk about this progressive era, right, there are three presidents that are involved. Roosevelt, Taft, and Wilson. And they all have kind of varying degrees of exactly how progressive they are and how successful they are in their implementation of policies. I would probably suggest that Teddy is the most progressive of them all, that Taft is perhaps the most misunderstood of them all, and that Wilson is perhaps the most pragmatic of them all, and perhaps most symbolic of eventually where America is going to be headed over the next couple decades. Wilson's foreign policy, okay, which we would compare to Teddy's big stick diplomacy, remember, and William Howard Taft's dollar diplomacy. These are terms you need to know, and I hope I'm making sense when I say them. Wilson's foreign policy is hallmarked by what he would call a moral diplomacy. He pursues less imperialistic policies. He improves relations with the Philippines, with Panama. Remember, Teddy got involved there, right, with the Panama Canal. So this might be indicative of Wilson's take on America's role in the world and, quite frankly, other countries' role in the world, which will become relevant when we get to the end of World War One, which we'll talk about later. Um, but Wilson is hinting perhaps at a little bit more of an isolationist America, certainly a less imperialistic America, and at least what he would characterize as a more moral America as it pertains to foreign policy. And this is evidenced when America witnesses the outbreak of war in Europe, the Great War. Okay. Now, there are a variety of factors contributing to the outbreak of World War One, which begins in Europe and begins without America. Um, the main, get it, the main causes of war are militarism, alliances, imperialism, and nationalism. So this kind of harkens back to what we identified as America's causes for becoming an imperialist nation, right? They could not fall out of line with the march of these other great imperialist nations. And we were talking largely then about England, Germany, Japan, right? That there's this Russia, there's this notion that all across the world, the great powers, the great world powers are increasingly militaristic. Increasingly, they are building alliances, sometimes secretly, notably with one another. They are increasingly imperialistic nations, and they are increasingly proud nations. Okay, that is to say, we've defined before, I think, this notion of nationalism, compared it to the sectionalism that we talked about in the prelude to the Civil War, right? An intense sense of pride in your section. Well, we talked about this notion of pride in our nation in the build up to the War of 1812 as well. And so, this notion of kind of national superiority that goes along with nationalism. Okay. And so, if we see these world powers all kind of adopting these characteristics, you could understand how eventually they are going to come to conflict with one another. Um, these are the underlying, the as I say here, the main causes of World War One. Now, of course, there is the immediate cause with the assassination of Franz Ferdinand, the Archduke of Austria, which is the match which sets off this pile of kindling, through which, by the way, Wilson advocates a policy of neutrality, right? Remember, he's going to kind of show hints of neutrality at best, maybe isolationism, right? Um, Maybe that's his view of moral diplomacy is staying out of the war. Um, I've got a video linked here that takes you a little bit more behind, again, that match which lit off the war. But I think it's really important we understand those quote unquote main causes of war, um, through which, again, Wilson is trying to remain neutral. But if you click on this video, it'll take you through a interesting walkthrough of the match that lit this pile of kindling on fire. Okay, again, so despite that, uh, Wilson is seeking to remain neutral. Now, they're never really entirely neutral in kind of their hearts and minds. Of course, the United States has a stronger connection to England than to Germany, right? We share this common history, a common sense of political institutions, a shared language, shared uh, past with respect to where the majority of most immigrants in the United States had come from, language and other cultural aspects. Um, and in fact, the American opinion of Germany is largely anti German. Okay. There's history there between Germany and England that would have us line up with England, even France as well. We're going to see an increase in as you see here in this poster, anti-German propaganda that would argue against kind of the brutes of Germany, this notion of this becoming a fight against autocracy, fascism, right? Um, and also from, again, what's the number one answer to every question ever asked? From an economic standpoint, American manufacturers, bankers, investors are heavily invested in the Allied cause. Okay, there's a lot of commerce and trade and loans back and forth between France and England and the United States. Um, and so while the United States under Wilson is looking to remain neutral, emotionally, we already kind of know with whom we at least would be aligned. Um, Germany doesn't make it any better on the notion of America staying out of this thing. Germany resorts to unrestricted submarine warfare. Um, and they draw more emotional investment from Americans when the Lusitania, which is a British passenger ship with 128 Americans on board, is sunk by a German sub. Um, and Germany says, "Okay, well, I'm sorry, we're not gonna sink any more neutral ships. Okay, our B." And so they go on and they sink more neutral ships, including the Sussex in 1916, um, about a year later, a little bit less than a year later. Woodrow Wilson responds by threatening to cut off diplomatic relations with Germany. Germany and the United States now are very close to war because these diplomatic relations are incredibly tense because of the German actions with respect to their unrestricted submarine warfare and attacking neutral and citizen ships, right? Neutral citizen ships with Americans on board. And Germany responds simply by making what they call the Sussex Pledge, that they're not going to sink any more ships without warning. And it's like, gee, thanks. You're going to just tell us before you kill um, innocent Americans. So again, there's this precipice of war. The United States and Germany are at the brink of war here. Um, but Wilson keeps us out of it. Okay. And in fact, when he runs for reelection in November of 1916, he easily wins because he reminds voters that he kept us out of war. That only Wilson could do this, that Wilson's a peacemaker, that we are not at war while the rest of the world is burning because Wilson keeps us out of war. He's a man of peace. And it's that platform, in large part, that gets Wilson reelected in 1916. So naturally, we go to war. Um, and it's, I say that kind of joking, like he promises to keep us out of war and then he brings us to war. But the fact of the matter is here, Germany is absolutely provoking in the United States and pushing every button they can possibly imagine. First, right, we had the violations of U.S. neutrality that we talked about with the Lusitania and the Sussex. Okay. And then, and this is just too rich, this story of the Zimmerman note. Um, The British intercept a German proposal from Mexico to attack the United States. So this is what happens. Germany sends a telegram to the Mexican government saying, "Hey, why don't you attack the United States? Okay, and you're going to get back all that territory those dudes stole from you. You know, the Mexican cession, all this stuff. They were so wrong. You absolutely remember Germany felt like they got kind of pillaged. That like at the end of the Mexican American War, that yeah, America bought that land, but they did so way on the cheap, and Mexico totally felt taken advantage of. So these relations between Mexico and the United States are kind of a little tender, right? And Germany, who just wants the United States to go to war because I don't know, they want to see the world burn. They're like, you start war, okay? Then we got your back, all right? And there's going to be a Mexican German alliance. And ultimately, we're going to help you get that land back, recover that lost territory. Um, but Germany sends this telegram, it's called the Zimmerman Note, through a British telegraph office in London. So the British obviously see this. They alert the United States, and the United States is like, okay, well, I guess they want us to go to war. It's on. Mexico never gets the message. Mexico is probably not involved. It's not a good idea for Mexico to attack the United States. They just do not have the military force that could withstand the retribution that would quickly fall upon them anyway. But this all goes down while Germany is still engaging in unrestricted submarine warfare. So in April 1917, Wilson asked Congress to declare war against Germany. Uh, Congress is more than happy to oblige, and the United States is off into World War One. Again, three key factors leading to the war: unrestricted German submarine warfare, the German attacks on American shipping, okay, the Lusitania, the Sussex Pledge. Then we've got this Zimmerman note, right? We just talked about that. And of course, the main causes: militarism, alliances, imperialism, and nationalism. You have to understand all of these factors conspiring together essentially as like the perfect storm that leads Wilson to ask Congress to declare war and get us involved in World War One. And so we are off and we are going in quote unquote the Great War. Okay. It wasn't called World War One at the time, of course, because there was no notion that there would be a World War Two. Of course, we're probably later going to make the argument that World War One causes World War Two because, spoiler alert, Germany is going to lose and spiral into an economic depression, and they might need some sort of like really bombastic leader to reignite their nationalism and take them out of that. That's the story of World War II. Okay. But it was called the Great War because at the time it was supposed to be the war to end all wars. There was going to be no more war after World War One. But here we are. America is mobilizing for war. They initially were entirely unprepared for war, so the mobilization effort required a lot of quick efforts and significant steps on part of the American government to get involved, including the establishment of the Selective Service Act, which organizes a draft for soldiers headed by a man by the name of General Pershing, by the way, who had been Wilson's right hand man in trying to previously work on some of these tender relations with Mexico. But the Selective Service Act is still with us today. That requires young people in America to register for a draft. So the Selective Service Act is the organization of a draft for young Americans to establish what we would call at the time an American Expeditionary Force, headed by Pershing. That would be a military readiness effort. Okay. So it's notable when we get to this topic that I'll talk about later here that World War One is the war that changes everything for America, including the constant readiness of a military force. This is also a what we call a total war effort. And this is really important because it asks for all aspects of the country, all population sectors to mobilize for the war effort, to contribute in some way, to be ready as a soldier, to buy war bonds, to pay increased income taxes, as you see here, both on the third bullet point, to consume less so that we have more for the war effort. This is going to be a similar theme that we're going to witness when we get to World War II as well. Again, World War I is the war that changes everything. So this is a total war effort, okay? Asking all Americans to contribute to the Great War. Um, there is the National War Labor Board, a new federal agency that's created to help mediate labor disputes and prevent strikes, because we can't be having strikes and slowing down production during the time when we need a total war effort. Okay. Some labor unions are, split on this. The American Federation of Labor supports the war effort. The International Workers of the World opposes the war effort. But the National War Labor Board, in either case, would step in and help mediate labor disputes. We cannot have a slowdown of production during a total war effort. The notion of Americans sacrificing consumption to save more for the war effort is an effort mediated by the War Industries Board, which sets production priorities for the war. Um, and helps to guide what really needs to be produced and for what purposes as America is gearing up to entering and continuing this war effort. The U.S. Food Administration, headed by Herbert Hoover, there's a name we're going to see more of later, again encourages Americans to conserve food for the war effort. So there's a total kind of rededication of the American economy and repurposing of the American consumer, all headed under this total war effort. Um, we also see the passage of the 18th Amendment, right, which prohibits the sale and consumption, manufacture, or transport of alcohol. We know that that's kind of a progressive era amendment because it was seen as a moral ill, of course, right? Because of the severe alcoholism that women in particular were paying the price of during this, abusive Gilded Age economy. But it gets more traction and gets passage as a constitutional amendment because of this total war effort, where we think that this will help us to conserve resources, okay? And focus the country on the warfare. And kind of funny, it's also due to anti German sentiment in the United States because beer is seen as a total German thing, right? And we don't want to drink beer and support the enemy, do we? Um, on the home front, there's significant social impact of this total war effort. We talk about the Great Migration, which starts in 1910. This incredible movement of African Americans from the South to the northern cities. It's really what I think we would call the second Great Migration, because we talked about the first Great Migration in wake of the Civil War, um, where it was freedmen looking for, um, well, the biggest reason, right, for human migration is for economic purposes, to improve the economic circumstances of one's family. Um, well, there's probably, it's not a picnic up north, but there's worse racial, social relations in the South than there is north. And because of World War One, there are incredibly more significant, successful job opportunities in the northern factories for Black Americans, as many white men are drafted for the war, because we're still in largely a white only or at best segregated war during World War One. So the total war effort, and remember that War Industries Board, which kind of repurposes the American manufacturing economy. um, sees incredible growth in the northern factories as they shift production to support the war. And remember, it's up north where most of the factories take place. So this results in this second Great Migration. 400,000 African Americans do serve in the war effort. They are still in segregated units. Um, there are going to be race riots during the late 19 teens as some of these demographic changes flare the racial tensions in a period that we talked about earlier, right? Where African Americans and their notion of civil rights is largely ignored, if not totally excluded from the white progressive politicians' agenda. Um, we talk about how the war increases the role of women in America. All right. Women play a key role in wartime factories, wartime manufacturing. And I think it's going to be not insignificant that the 19th Amendment passes in 1920. Um, yes, as a result of this women's suffrage movement, but also because the candle on top of that is the fact that we see women making such significant contributions to the war effort, and with that, they are assisted in their fight to secure the right to vote. So the impact of the war on the home front cannot be overestimated in a number of different regards, including these demographic changes, women's rights, a little bit more of how we're going to see this notion of civil rights kind of take off for African Americans, keeping in mind that we're eventually going to get post-war II um, this establishment of a Black American culture in American cities that we witness with the Harlem Renaissance, right? We talked a little bit about that when we talked about Langston Hughes and 1920s northern urban cities that are created in large part and where the cultures blossom in large part because of the Second Great Migration. So incredible impacts of World War I on the American home front. Um, and not a lot of backlash from protesters or dissent against World War One. Some of that, of course, is straight up because of government efforts to silence dissent. The Committee of Public Information is a government body that promotes U.S. war propaganda. Um, you see, we saw a poster before, right, portraying the Germans as brutes. Here's a call for that total war effort, asking Americans to buy bonds. So, by the way, what a bond is right is a government uh, financial institution. But like, I would give the government money and I get a piece of paper in return, a bond, saying they're going to pay me back that money plus interest, nominal, not a lot, but it's a safe investment because I know it's backed by the government. Okay. But the government needs cash now to fund this war effort. So the total war effort, remember, calls for Americans to make these sacrifices and buy these bonds, right? So that the government has cash to fund the war effort. The Committee of Public Information here produces a poster, Beat Back the Hun with Liberty Bonds. So give us cash, help us fund this. And that Hun, that nasty looking creature with blood dripping from the bayonet, can't cross the Atlantic and get us. So if you want to stay safe, buy a bond. Um, we have a lot of propaganda that attack all things German, right? I mean, to consider, as I said earlier, that we could convince Americans not to drink beer because that's German. Um, but we'll talk a little bit more about some of this propaganda. But there's also significant steps towards silencing dissent when it comes to things like the Espionage Act of 1917, the Sedition Act of 1918. Remember that word, right? and again, it means in this instance, it's banning anyone from criticizing the government, saying anything bad about the United States government. This goes back to, harkens back to the same kind of idea that John Adams had in his Alien and Sedition Acts, right? So these are governmental policies that are meant to absolutely silent any voices speaking out against the government, against the war. It's important that the total war effort incorporates total, moral, emotional, vocal support by Americans for the war. Um, I mentioned coming back to some propaganda. Uh, we talked on the previous slide, right, about the Committee of Public Information. If you will click on this link here on this slide of World War I American propaganda, you are going to see a little film by that Committee of Public Information. And it's attached to all of these images of so many government posters that I think are fascinating. You can take a look at this slide, you can take a look at this video, and then come back to me. It's not just posters, it's not just government acts. There is a very significant ruling of the United States Supreme Court, SCOTUS, that we need to know as it pertains to this topic of silencing dissent. The case is 1919 Shank v. US. So there's this guy in New York, Charles Shank, and he is arrested under this Espionage Act that we talked about from 1917, intended to silence dissent, because he mails anti war leaflets to men eligible for the draft, which is essentially like all young men, 18, 19, 20 years old, right? And and the government arrests Shank because they think that that is dangerous. That he's what he's doing puts the country in danger, because if men believe what he has to say and resist the draft, America's not going to be ready for war. We're going to lose the war, and we're all going to be speaking German before you know it. Um, and the Supreme Court supports. The United States wins this case. Supreme Court supports the argument that freedom of speech can be restricted if that speech poses, quote unquote, here, okay, it's not just a Tom Clancy novel, a clear and present danger to the United States. It seems like a fairly low bar that men receiving anti war pamphlets presents a clear and present danger. But such is, how ironic, I'm about to use a German word, the zeitgeist in America in 1919, that the government says, yo, absolutely, that presents a clear and present danger, because we can't have guys that would otherwise be drafted not believing in the American cause. Shank v. United States speaks to a larger principle in American society, whereby national security and your civil liberties are always kind of weighed one against the other. Okay. And as it turns out, time and again, no matter how much we think America is kind of this land of freedom, the government has consistently acted in a manner and ruled in a favor that would indicate that national security always outweighs civil liberties. Um, I mentioned earlier, right? John Adams and the Sedition Acts. We had talked before about how Abraham, the great Abraham Lincoln, the great emancipator himself, suspended habeas corpus, present the body during the Civil War, that he would just lock people up and throw away the key if he thought that they were a threat. So here we have Shank v. the United States, where it's ruled that no, you can't print anything that's anti-war, because that presents a clear and present danger. That's the big ruling out of Shank, right? And we still kind of see that today, right? Like, why, you are, more than justified that, you give up all notion of privacy entering an airport, for instance, right? You don't have Fourth Amendment protections against illegal search and seizure and having your bag scanned because there is a national security interest at play there for preventing terrorism. Um, in wake of 9/11, you can pretty much kiss any expectation of electronic privacy to be waived, right? That the government has the right to get into. There's a lot of convolution here, but your internet search history, your phone records, and that sort of thing um, are largely available to government surveillance in wake of the Patriot Act, which was passed in wake of 9/11, um, because national security will always outweigh civil liberties, especially in times of a crisis. Okay, like the Shank ruling was during a time of war. But think about it, we've always been at war your entire life. But just to understand, this is a constant theme that's being played out in American society. Okay. Um, and that kind of ends us in our topic of Wilson's version of progressivism, Wilson's failures at progressivism, and how and why the United States ultimately gets involved in the Civil War, in World War One, and how the home front on America is changed as a result of America's entry into World War One. And as I'm going to get into, beginning with a new video starting on this slide, World War One is the war that changes it all. Okay, and so I thank you for your time on this video, and now you're going to get into the next one. I'm sorry that I'm not feeling well enough to kind of stand and deliver and do this live. I hope you all have a wonderful spring break. Enjoy this next video too, because I'm just so darn good at this. I know. You can't get enough. Take care, guys.